All right, so welcome to everybody. Today is February the 13th, the day before Valentine's Day. If you want to follow in the study guide, it's page 100. We're in Daniel chapter 6. I got it up here on the board if you want to follow along there. So as I mentioned in the opening prayer, we're talking about Daniel and the lion's den. How many people have ever heard that story? Anyone? It's one of the many that I remember as a kid. It's interesting as I kind of read through it now with a different perspective and to get the significance of it. And again, our study guide, they really do a good job of bringing out things of it's not just a story, not just the story of God protecting Daniel when he's in this lion's den. I told the pastor this morning, he goes, "Hey, what's the lesson today?" And I said, "It's about a lion's den." And he goes, "Was it a lion's den or was it a den of lions?" Because that makes a big difference. If you think about, Daniel thrown into a lion's den, there's bear caves, bear dens, whatever, bear hollows, wherever bears stay. There's lions' dens. If there's nothing in it, it wouldn't be scary at all to spend the night in there, would it? So a lion's den is not necessarily a scary thing. A den of lions, a den of bears, a pit of snakes, that does make a difference. So this is, I guess, Daniel in a den of lions. And we'll talk about why. That's the important things to me out of this. There's three. One is how this happened that caused Daniel to get thrown into this den of lions. Two, of course, that God protected him. And three, what Darius, the king, or Darius, depending on how you pronounce his name, how he felt about Daniel going into the lion's den, and how he felt when he realized that Daniel was still alive, and then what happened immediately after that. Okay, so just sort of listen up for those as we go. The introduction, the title of the lesson is called Trust Exhibited. And of course, this is all about trust, Daniel's trust in God. As we listen to this lesson, think about how we hopefully can trust in God no matter what's going on in our lives. Because there are times that none of us, I don't think, have ever been thrown into a den of lions or into a field with a raging bull or something that's really dangerous or threatening. But we all have our challenges. We all have the things that feel to us like, wow, this is just too much. I don't know what to do, right? In those, no matter how small other people may see it or how small it is to us or how big it is in all things, we should be able to trust God. And that's important too. God didn't always bring people through those trials. And references that in the lesson as well. But this is one of the cases where he did. All right, so the introduction, again, the title says Trust Exhibited, and the subtitle says Believers Can Trust God in All Circumstances. So hopefully, again, we know that, we remember it, and that will help us anytime we're struggling in our life. But the opening introductory paragraph says, one of the benefits of walking with God for many years is seeing firsthand how he can be trusted and that the Bible is right about everything. So if you think about that, the Bible is not just a book of stories. There are really good stories because it is history. There's interesting prophecies. Of course, when you think about the Old Testament, there's a lot of stories, lessons, prophecy there. And of course, the New Testament is focused around Jesus and the gospel, his life, or his ministry rather, and then his crucifixion, and then the lessons that a lot of things that Paul wrote after he had his experience with Jesus. But it says again that God can be trusted, and the Bible is right about everything. The Bible is right about money, true contentment, sex and marriage, leadership, relationships, and so much more. A lot of people, when you think about the Bible, they think, oh, it's about God or about Jesus. Well, listen to that list again. And this is not an exhaustive list. This is just some things that are important to us today. Money, true contentment, sex and marriage, leadership, relationships, and so much more. The Bible is right about all of that. It's all in here and a lot of other things. Long-term believers who live by God's principles see them validated again and again. And that's, I will keep telling you all this, that I can teach you, I can bring you these lessons, the pastor can bring a message every week. And hopefully what we're bringing you is out of the Bible with the help of a study guide or whatever things me or the pastor or other teachers use. But unless and until you read it for yourself, I will always strive to not mislead you in any way about the Bible. Okay? You've heard the pastor say he will be held accountable, when he stands in front of God for the things that he has taught as a pastor. I feel the same way that God will grade me, I guess you could say, on my understanding of His Word and how I have kind of presented it to others. So it's very, very important. But until you read it for yourself, then it'll maybe do two things. Maybe you'll say, oh, now I understand that better, or, I didn't realize that was in the Bible. There are lots of quotes and things that I've read that you go, oh, that's where that came from. But when you read it for yourself, it does a couple things. Hopefully affirms what you've heard, but also convicts you to do what's right and to believe this is true. So now to get into the story, the verses for today are Daniel 6, 10 through 24. Before I get to those, just the overall context of the lesson. And you can see here in the first few verses of Daniel, if you're looking up there at the screen, Nebuchadnezzar was the king he was the king that conquered Jerusalem, Israel, and then Jerusalem. He conquered lots of things. He was the king of that world. He fell. His kingdom was conquered by the Medes and the Persians. So Darius becomes this king. And you see, when he became the ruler, one man can't be the king over everything. He can't know and do everything. Same with the president of the United States. They must have some kind of advisors or people to help them do their job. And you can see in the first verse that Darius set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom. Okay, so he had 120 people that he selected some way that were going to be the ones that were sort of the governors or senators or however you want to look at it related to our government, the people that sort of did the actual managing of his kingdom. And then in verse 2, over the 120, he set 3 presidents, so 3 that were like those but elevated somewhat, of whom Daniel was first. So what this tells you is that Darius somehow found out about Daniel. Of course, Nebuchadnezzar knew about him, right? Because Daniel had interpreted dreams for Nebuchadnezzar. How Darius found out about Daniel, we don't know, but he realized that he was a smart man and he had something going for him. So not only did he elevate him above the 120, but he made them the head of the 3 presidents, as he calls them here, which was good for Daniel. But in a lot of cases, like in the world today, if you are elevated, hopefully because of your merit, that someone sees in you or something like that, there are others who may really wanted that position. You're the captain of the football team. You're the head of the cheerleaders. You're the best debater in the debate class. You're the best clarinet player in the band, the best singer in the choir. And it's not something that you kind of brag about or lord over people. It just may be that you have a natural talent, or people see that and they go, you know what? I want we're going to elevate you to be in this position. Well, that other person who says, man, I wanted to be the captain of the football team. I think I'm better than her at singing or whatever it is. For whatever reason, there are people that might tend to want you to fail. And they may actively attempt to undermine you in some ways. Okay. And that's just a fact of life. That's human nature, sadly. Hopefully people would celebrate and go, wow, congratulations. That's awesome. I'm here to support you and do my part. And I want to be just like you, so that when you leave, now I move up in that position. Same thing happened to Daniel. When you look at verse 4, then the presidents and princes, so the other guys, sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom. They were trying to undermine him. They wanted him removed from that position. But they could find no occasion or fault, for as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. That they could not find that fault in him. That's not saying he's perfect, but he was a godly man. He lived a good life, okay? And that says a lot about him. And I have to think that Daniel, although I've talked about this before, it's good to have self-confidence. We all, you want to be kind of demure or not shy, but not braggadocious. But it's good to have self-confidence, to know your worth, okay? Because no matter how bad you may be at math, you're good at other things, right? uh, whatever that thing is. So we need to have that confidence, understand our weaknesses and try to improve, understand our strengths and what we're good at, and have self-confidence. And I have to think that Daniel was a modest man, even though God had elevated him through King Darius to a very high position, basically second in this kingdom as far as only second only to the king. So they could not find any fault in him. In verse 5, we can't find, so they said amongst themselves, we can't find any occasion against this Daniel except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. The only fault that they could find against him was he was faithful to his God. Now, what does that say about Daniel? That's the only fault they could find. That's a good thing. If someone looked at me, and this is not the case, to say the only fault, the only thing wrong with me is that I just serve God too well. I have faults, trust me. And there's a witness over there that could, tell you some of my faults. Hopefully she won't, and in my presence, she can tell you later. But no person is perfect, okay? But we want to try to be good people. And if the only fault they could find with him was that he served his God so well, that's good for him. But then they decided they were going to use that against him, right? Does this sound familiar? Because it's sad and tragic. And that's another thing that I'll tell you in today's world. There are people that if people know that you are a Christian, particularly if you're a devout Christian, right? There are some that will try to use that against you, okay? If you stand up for yourself, if you stand against things that you know are wrong, and as high school people, trust me, I know there are lots of bad influences around you, and it's difficult at times to stand against that. If you do, hopefully like-minded people will say, wow, that was impressive that you did that. There will be others that will say, man, she's weird or he's weird. What's wrong with that guy? It's good to, I believe there's a God too, but my goodness, they're taking it too far. Okay. So there's a lesson for us out of this too, is that we should strive to be faithful to God. All right. So here's what they did. Verse 6, the presidents and princes assembled together. They got together to the king, and here's their plan. They start with a praise. King Darius, live forever. We love you, King. We want you to be successful. If we could, we'd want you to live forever. Now, here's what they do in verse 7. All the presidents of the kingdom, the governors and the princes, the counselors and the captains, so all of the kind of the leaders in your kingdom have consulted together to establish a royal statute. We want you to make a law, a firm decree that whoever shall ask a petition of God, of any God or man, for 30 days, save of thee, except you, O king, he shall be cast into the den of lions. So there's that. It's not the lion's den, it's the den of lions. So the pastor was right. He shall be cast into the den of lions. So I would like to think this king was relatively smart. Some weren't. There were some kings. There are politicians in this day and time that you scratch your head and you go, how did that person get elevated to a position of authority? You may find a boss. You may have a teacher. You may have a principal. There are people that you look at and you go, and maybe it's just you don't understand it. Maybe they are a smart person, but because of the things they do, you kind of go, I don't agree with that. It may actually be right, but it's just, something you disagree with. Kind of like if someone says, you really shouldn't swear. You shouldn't use those words. And you go, well, who are you to judge me, right? So you can have conflict with people. But I would like to think that if I was a king or a leader of something, and a group of people came to me and said, hey, we've got an idea. Here's what we think would be a cool idea. It's only for 30 days. But anybody who worships anything other than you for 30 days, we think they should be thrown into the lion's den. I hope I would stop and think, okay, I get it that I'm the king and that people should be respectful to me, respect my authority, but for a period of 30 days, why wouldn't you say forever? If you think that much of me, why wouldn't it be forever? Okay, for whatever reason, and I'm sure they had put a lot of thought into this, and maybe the king had a little bit of arrogance to him, which would not surprise me for a king or a high-ranking politician, because over time that power is very corrupting. But in any case, so they said, we want you to make a law that says for the next 30 days, anybody who worships anything or anyone other than you is going to be thrown into the den of lions. Now, O king, in verse 8, establish the decree and sign the writing that it be not changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. In their day, if the king signed a law or decree, he couldn't take it back, which is odd to me too, that to me a king should be able to, if I make a decision in my life or in my job and I say, I've studied this and this is the way it's going to be. And then I realize later, whether it's the next day or subsequently, because of consequences, or I rethink, or I learn something new that affected my decision, why couldn't I say, I made a mistake. We're not going to do that. Why should I not be able to do that? The way their law worked, he couldn't, which is odd, but that was the way it was. So they convinced him. You can see there in verse 9, wherefore King Darius signed the writing and decree. Okay, I'll sign it. Next, what's next on my agenda? All right. So let's read 10 through 24. I'm just going to read straight through it because this is what happens now that the king has signed the decree. All right. Starting in verse 10. Now, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed, and gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. Then they came near and spake before the king concerning the king's decree. Hast thou not signed a decree that every man that shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days, save of thee, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Then answered they and said before the king, that Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah, regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed, but maketh his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Then these men assembled unto the king, and said unto the king, Know, O king, that the law of the Medes and Persians is, that no decree nor statute which the king establisheth may be changed. Then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, Thy God, whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. And a stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that the purpose might not be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace, and passed the night fasting. Neither were instruments of music brought before him, and his sleep went from him. Then the king arose very early in the morning, and went in haste unto the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel. And the king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God, whom thou servest continually, able to deliver thee from the lions? Then said Daniel unto the king, O king, live forever. My God hath sent his angel, and hath shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me. For as much as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. Then was the king exceeding glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him, because he believed in his God. And the king commanded, and they brought those men which had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, and their wives. And the lions had the mastery of them, and brake all their bones in pieces, or ever they came at the bottom of the den. That's that last verse there is kind of like a real wow to me when as I read through this, I'm reminded of that. But we'll come to that here in a few minutes. Okay, so the 10 through 24, that's kind of the story that we have heard before. Now let's kind of take it apart just a little bit. All right, so first of all, and you look at verse 10, it says, Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed. Do you think these presidents and these governors, whatever they call these 120 that were set above, they knew, again, that Daniel was a devout, godly man. So they knew his habits. They knew, I will assume, that they knew he prayed 3 times a day. That was the law. That was the rules for the Jews at the time, was that they faced Jerusalem and they prayed 3 times a day. So they knew that's what Daniel did. That's what I have to think. Daniel, of course, heard that this decree was signed, because I'm sure when something was signed, it went out to all the land. This is the king's decree. This is the law. Okay. So when he found out it was signed, you think he went, oh my, I guess I can't pray for the next 30 days, because if I do, according to the king's decree, I'm going to be in trouble. I'm going to get thrown into a den of lions. Clearly, he did not. Now, when he knew that the writing was signed, and I don't think this means as soon as he heard it, he goes, I'll show that king, and went straight to his house and prayed. I interpret this as meaning he knew that the writing was signed, that there was a law. He went into his house. He did what he always did every day. He did not change. He did not change the way he worshiped God. He did not change his faith because of this law. And what does that say? Again, remember the title of the lesson is Trust Exhibited. He had to know that there would be a penalty for disobeying the king. The king, based on the law of the time, he would not be able to just turn the other way and, oh, Daniel, I like him, I'm going to give him a pass. Maybe he would have wanted to. Well, and you heard what the 120 wise men or whatever they're called did. So he goes to his house. His windows being open toward Jerusalem, just like he was supposed to. He faced Jerusalem and he prayed 3 times a day, kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day, and he prayed and gave thanks before God as he did aforetime. He had not changed anything. And of course, these guys were just waiting. Remember, I told you how there may be people that would want to undermine your success. Okay, these men assembled and found him praying. Oh, look, I'm sure they were shocked. Well, look, Daniel's praying and making supplication before his God, like he always had. Well, so they go straight to the king, spoke to the king concerning the king's decree there in verse 12. Hey, king, we were just wondering, didn't you sign a law or something that says that anybody who asks a petition of God or anything else, anyone else within 30 days, except for you, should be cast into the den of lions? Don't remember seeing something like that? And the king might have thought, yeah, guys, you're the ones who brought it to me and I signed it, right? The king answered and said, of course, the thing is true according to the law of Medes and Persians, which altereth not. I did sign the law, and that's the law of the land. Oh, they say in verse 13, they answer before the king, that Daniel, Daniel, who's one of the children of the captivity of Judah. Of course, the king knew who Daniel was. He regardeth not that. He's kind of blowing you off. He's not following your law. He's regarding not you, nor he's ignoring both you and the decree that you signed. As a matter of fact, he's still making his petition to someone else 3 times a day. And notice the king's reaction in verse 14. Then the king, when he heard these words, was he mad at Daniel? He said, go bring him to me and let's throw him in the lion's den right now. No. Then the king, when he heard these words, he was sore displeased with himself. What do you think he realized at that moment? He'd been tricked, right? Because he did like Daniel. He respected Daniel. He had elevated Daniel above all the others. So that's how I interpret that, is he was sore displeased at himself. And furthermore, in verse 14, he set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. He was racking his brain to think, how am I going to get me out of this? But more importantly, how am I going to save Daniel? Because he clearly did not want to have to throw Daniel into that den of lions. He labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. So apparently, it wasn't an immediate. If you think about the story we talked about, I think it was last week or the week before with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I think it was 2 weeks ago. As soon as they were found to not worship the image, the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had made, they brought them right then. And the king said, hey, I'm going to give you one chance to bow down and worship this image. And they said, we don't have to think about it. We're not going to do it. And he said, immediately, stoke up the fire and throw them in, right? Well, in this case, apparently the king had until the end of the day, but then he had to execute the sentence that he had decreed. So he was sore displeased with himself there in verse 14. He set his heart on Daniel to deliver him and he labored till the going down of the sun. He tried to think all day, how am I going to stop this from happening? But, verse 15, then these men assembled to the king. So these leaders came and said, King, there's really nothing else we can do because it's the law. You've got to throw him in the den of lions. You can't, there's no way around it. You know, in verse 15, know, O king, that the law of the Medes and the Persians is that no decree nor statute which the king establisheth may be changed. Must we remind you, king, that because you made a law, it can't be changed? Okay? So the king realized that, again, based on the law at the time, and probably to avoid embarrassing himself or having to admit that he had made a mistake, in verse 16, he commanded, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. So first of all, it sort of talked about in the study guide about how this den of lions, I try to imagine in my mind what was, it wasn't a cave because you wouldn't want the lions to be able to get out, or maybe you have to get them in somewhere out, but to throw someone in, there maybe was some way of lowering or, casting them in. And did they just throw someone in because they were going to die anyway, or did they lower them down? Don't really know. Study guide sort of talks about it. Before I get to that, there's one question that the study guide mentions, and it talks about how Daniel broke the law, because he did break the king's law, right? The king made this decree. Daniel knew that, and he deliberately went against that law. And so there's a part in the study guide, I'm on page 103, and it says that Daniel was not afraid. He went to his house and prayed as always. Daniel's trust in the Lord was his security. As followers of the Lord, we can have confidence in the Lord in the face of our enemies. So that's how we can relate that part to this. But there's a question here in the study guide. It says, where is the line for believers when it comes to ignoring or knowingly disobeying laws that restrict religious freedom? Pastor mentioned this last week in his sermon that we're kind of bound to obey the laws of the land. It says that in the Bible. Okay, we shouldn't pick and choose which laws we decide not to obey. However, there is a time, and there's in the study guide a blurb, and it says here, this is the CSB version of a verse from. Well, actually, this is a paraphrase of it. It says, "Civil government, being ordained of God, it is the duty of Christians to render loyal obedience thereto, in all things, not contrary to the revealed will of God." Okay, so again, that's from 1 Peter, and it's a sort of a paraphrase of 5-6 verses. But if you think about that again, so civil government, our government, from the president, the Congress, the judiciary system, to the 3 branches, executive, legislative, and judicial branches of our government, it's ordained of God. The Bible says that God puts people in authority over us, okay? Civil government being ordained of God, it is the duty of Christians to render loyal obedience thereto. So we are commanded to obey the laws of our government, to respect the authority. In all things, here's the caveat, not contrary to the revealed will of God. So if you think about, if a law were to come down that says we're going to, we think the population of the United States is a little bit too high, and so for the next year, we are not going to allow any children to be born in the United States because we're running out of resources. There's not enough land, there's not enough food, whatever it is. So for the next year, we're not going to allow any children to be born. Well, and they provide birth control, whatever. You know how human nature is. There is nothing that is absolute. Somebody is going to get pregnant in that year, right? I mean, that's going to be a fact of life. Well, but wait, the law says for a year we're not going to do that. We're not going to allow anyone to be born. So what would that mean? Would they make an exception? Oh, well, we weren't expecting anyone to really get pregnant, so we're going to allow this. Or would they say, I'm sorry, but you've got to go see a doctor and we're going to terminate that pregnancy. Okay? would you do? What should they do? Now that's I just sort of kind of made that up, but clearly, hopefully, in the United States, certainly of all places, they would never do that. In China, they've had that policy for years. They had what was called a one-child policy, and it said because there are I don't know what the number is now, a couple of billion people. The United States is 330-ish million population. China, I think it's around 2 billion. I don't remember even a real broad number, but it's a lot of people. And um, they said to avoid overpopulating, you can only have one child per family. And the tendency is families wanted to have male children because boys are perhaps they are physically better to do labor. Like if I'm a Chinese farmer, I need boys, right? I mean, girls can certainly do things on a farm, but I want boys because they're strong. I mean, it's just I'm stronger than most women. I'm sure there's a woman stronger than me, but generally speaking, I'm a father on a farm. I want a man because he's going to have to be tilling. He's going to have to cut down trees, digging up stumps, gathering the cattle, fighting off the wolves, fighting off the people that come to steal our stuff. I want boys, and I can only have one child. So if my wife gets pregnant and we find out through an ultrasound or however it may have been done in the past, ooh, you're going to have a girl? Ain't happening. And I mean, this is true. This is reality. This is in the past for a long, long time. Maybe they said, we can't do that. I want a boy. So that pregnancy is terminated. Right? That's an abortion. Perhaps if they didn't know that it was they didn't see beforehand, through an ultrasound and a girl was born, I can only have one, so that one needs to go away. Okay. First of all, think about that just from a moral perspective, how horrific that is. Second, I think that may have changed in the not too distant past. That they went away from a one-child policy, maybe to a two-child policy. But still, so again, I started with perhaps what if in the United States this happened? We would hopefully that would never happen because that means our leaders in our country have totally turned away from anything moral and certainly godly, right? But in China, they had no choice because there was a consequence. Right? So that's just an example of when you would be bound to disobey. All right. So if the government goes against what you know to be the revealed will of God, God would never advocate or accept killing certainly an innocent child. Just one example. All right. So the king had no choice. He commanded, and they brought Daniel in verse 16 and brought him and cast him into the den of lions. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, thy God whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. In the CSB, it says that verse, it reads like this. The king said to Daniel, may your God whom you continually serve rescue you. So that's how the CSB version of the Bible says it. King James, the king said, Daniel, thy God whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. That one is more of a statement that to me is almost a statement of faith by King Darius in Daniel's God. This one makes it sound more like a prayer, and that's how it says it in the study guide. It says, Darius attempted to encourage Daniel. Actually, let me go back here. It says, moreover, it would appear to be out of place for a king to offer a defendant a word of prayer. First, it said it would be odd for a king to come to the defendant's defense, like he tried to think of how to save Daniel from the lions. But it would be truly unusual for a king to offer a prayer for this defendant who was sentenced to death, considering that the offender had acted against the king himself. Remember, Daniel had directly challenged the king. Yet Darius did. And again, it says, may your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you. So they make it sound like almost like a prayer. And it says at this point, we should remember that Darius was not a follower of the Lord, yet his plea was genuine. It was made to God for Daniel's deliverance and to Daniel not to give up on his God. So I don't think Daniel needed that encouragement because Daniel had the faith to defy the king anyway. I think it probably would have made Daniel feel good that the king said, Daniel, may your God save you or rescue you. Okay. They put Daniel into the den, however they did it. They put a rock over it. The king sealed it with his own signet. So remember, they would either put ropes around it. Anybody here seen what was the movie? It's called Risen, and it's about it kind of tells a story after Jesus is crucified, and then he comes back, and a Roman centurion is tasked with finding out is Jesus still alive or not. And one of the scenes is when they put Jesus in the tomb, and all of the religious leaders came to the Pilate there and said, okay, he predicted that he's going to be risen in 3 days. So what that tells us is that his followers are going to go steal his body. And then they're going to say, oh, look, the body's gone from the grave. So look, he's really risen. So in order to prevent that, we need for you, Roman government representative, to seal this tomb. And the way they depicted it was they tied ropes around this stone. They put big globs of wax on it. Because if you think about, you put the big globs of melted wax on. Once it hardens, it would be very clear if a rope had been pulled through that wax, right? To know that someone had disturbed or broken into that grave. And then once they put the wax on it, they put a signet, some kind of a symbol into that wax that showed this is official. Otherwise, I could go that night and it would be elaborate, but I could melt all that wax, take it apart, take Jesus' dead body out, put it back together, put some more wax on it, and it looks the same the next morning. If it's got a seal stuck in it and I disturb that, I can't recreate that. So they sealed this tomb. So, and then what did the king do? He couldn't sleep that night. He didn't want to eat. He goes back and he's restless all night thinking, what have I done? So the first thing in the morning, he goes up in verse 19 and he goes in haste to the den. And when he comes to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice. He cried out to hoping, and I got to think he was hoping, when he said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God. Now there's an acknowledgement right there. Servant of the living God. Is thy God whom thou servest continually able to deliver thee from the lions? You think he expected an answer? Maybe he was hopeful. I don't know. I got to think he was a little surprised when Daniel answered in verse 21. Then said Daniel unto the king, and Daniel was respectful too. Daniel liked the king. Daniel served the king because that's what God wanted him to do. O king, live forever, just like the other 119 guys had done. And then he explained, my God hath sent his angel and hath shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me. For as much as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, king, O king, have I done no hurt. God protected me because I honored him. I had no fault in front of him, nor did I have any fault in front of you. So God protected me. Verse 23, then was the king exceeding glad for him, and commanded they should take him, get him up out of that lion's den. So certainly they would have probably had to lower something in to get him out of there. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him, because he believed in his God. So there's that trust being rewarded. And then the last part there in verse 24, this is the justice part of it. As sad as it was for these men, and what surprised me when I read this, a long time ago, and it kind of, I go, oh wow, was it just them? They brought those men that had accused Daniel and their families, their wives, their children, and they cast them into the den of lions. And notice it says, and the lions had the mastery of them and break their bones or ever they came at the bottom of the den. And the way the CSB says it is, they brought them, their children, and their wives. They had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. So there really were lions in there, and they really were doing what lions would do, which would be if they were hungry or they're attacking, whatever it was. So they did to those people exactly what a wild lion would do to any prey. I'm going to close this with the last paragraph in the study guide. And it's and just as a reminder to us, because what I really like to do, these stories, they're fascinating. A lot of people don't like to call them stories because it makes it sound like a fairy tale. It is a story. It's history, right? Story is part of the word history. So I have no problem calling it a story from the Bible, knowing, of course, that I believe every word in this, right? So it's not just a fairy tale. Um, but the closing paragraph in the study guide, the reminder to us as we carry this lesson into our daily life, it says the account of Daniel in the lion's den reminds us that we can trust God in all circumstances. That's the lesson. No matter what we're going through, no matter what we will go through. We can trust God in all circumstances. Others may try to limit our worship or discourage us from taking our faith too seriously. And again, I look at a group of high school teenagers, and I know I was one a while back in high school, and I know, and it's not just high school; it's throughout your entire life. Others may try to limit our worship or discourage us from taking our faith too seriously. In some places today, believers face persecution and death for their faith, and that's true. Nevertheless, we can trust that God knows our situation and will act in our situation to bring honor to himself as we remain faithful to him. And I'll step back. There's a reminder in here that in Hebrews it talked about there were martyrs for their faith. Stephen was one that comes to mind. Stephen was one that stood in the face of a whole bunch of people. He was one of the first. He was the first martyr in the Bible who, for his faith, he stood in front of these Jewish leaders and said, "Let me tell you what I know about God," because he was a fledgling Christian, and they stoned him, right? And Stephen looked up and he saw Jesus at the right hand of God. He had that vision. So he was calm and peaceful when he died. Okay. So God does not protect you necessarily to the point of living, remaining alive. But when you're faithful to him, there is that reward that comes after that. Okay. For Christians. Okay. I don't want to end on too much of a down note. I'll go back to the account of Daniel and the lion's den reminds us that we can trust God in all circumstances. Questions, comments? Let me end this stream. Thank you all for being here. I'm truly glad you're here. All right.